Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw the footprints, I convinced myself they were just another peculiarity of Warehouse 37, an old railway depot with countless oddities accumulated over its century of existence. But oddities don't move. They don't reposition themselves night after night, inching closer to the exit as if something invisible was slowly making its escape. And they certainly don't sink into hardened cement, as if the concrete were as soft as wet sand. My name is Thomas Reeves, and after 15 years as a customs inspector, I thought I'd seen everything. I've discovered contraband in the hollow metal, legs of antique furniture, narcotics sealed inside industrial machinery, and even a live endangered species hidden in a shipment of decorative vases. But nothing in my career prepared me for what awaited me in Warehouse 37. The assignment seemed straightforward: catalog and process abandoned freight containers following a bankruptcy filing by Northeast Rail Transit. Most of the cargo had been sitting unclaimed for years, sometimes decades. The paperwork was a mess: shipping manifests missing, ownership disputed, customs declarations incomplete. The department sent me because I had a reputation for thoroughness. My supervisor joked that I could find a tax discrepancy in my sleep. If only my dreams had remained so mundane. Warehouse 37 sits on the outskirts of town, at the end of a defunct rail spur that hadn't seen a train in at least 15 years. The building itself dates back to the 1920s, a looming structure of brick and steel with windows so coated in grime that they barely let in light. The first time I turned the key in the rusted padlock, the door resisted, groaning as if warning me to reconsider my entrance. The interior was exactly what you'd expect: concrete floors, metal rafters overhead, and row upon row of shelving units filled with dust-covered cargo containers. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners, and the air tasted stale, as if it hadn't circulated in years. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, several of them dead entirely, creating alternating patches of harsh illumination and heavy shadow. I began my inventory on the far side of the warehouse, methodically working my way through shipping containers, wooden crates, and cardboard boxes. Most contained mundane items, outdated electronics, machine parts for equipment no longer manufactured, clothing that had gone out of style decades ago. The work was tedious but straightforward. 3 days in, I reached the central corridor. That's when I first noticed them: a line of footprints that began, inexplicably, at the wall, and terminated about 8 feet into the corridor. They were adult-sized, appearing to be from a work boot or similar heavy shoe, and each print was sunken approximately half an inch into the concrete floor. I crouched down to examine them, running my fingers along the depression. The concrete felt solid, not damaged or deteriorating. It was as if someone wearing immensely heavy boots had walked across the floor while the cement was still wet, except the warehouse floor had been poured over 80 years ago. My rational mind sought explanations. Perhaps they were decorative impressions, made during construction. Maybe someone had purposely altered the floor at some point for reasons I couldn't fathom. I took photographs, made notes in my inventory log, and continued with my work, though I found my eyes continually drawn back to those mysterious impressions. Later that afternoon, I ran my metal detector over a stack of unmarked wooden crates. The device functioned normally, alerting me to nails, hinges, and other metallic components. But when I passed it over the floor near the footprints, it emitted a different tone, higher pitched, almost musical. I moved the detector back and forth, trying to pinpoint the source. The strange tone seemed to follow the footprints, and then extend beyond them, as if marking a path invisible to my eyes. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the cold concrete. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic jingling like keys on a ring or small metal objects knocking together. The sound came from within the floor itself. I tapped the concrete, then struck it harder with the handle of my screwdriver. The floor was solid, unquestionably so, yet the jingling continued, unaffected by my interference. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sounds were moving, slowly, methodically, tracking along the invisible extension of the footprint path. I stumbled backward, heart pounding against my rib cage. My palms grew slick with sweat, and my breathing quickened. For the first time in my professional life, I felt an overwhelming urge to abandon my assignment. Instead, I packed up early, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I'd return the next day with better equipment, perhaps ground-penetrating radar or an ultrasonic device that could reveal what lay beneath the surface. I locked the warehouse door behind me and drove home, the sound of phantom keys jingling playing in my mind throughout the sleepless night that followed. The next morning, I arrived as the sun was breaking over the horizon, coffee in hand, equipment bag slung over my shoulder. I unlocked the warehouse, determined to approach the phenomenon with scientific detachment, but all thoughts of rational investigation evaporated the moment I reached the central corridor. The footprints had moved. Each impression had shifted approximately 3 inches backward from their previous position, closer to the exit door. I stood frozen, coffee spilling unnoticed over my trembling hand. My mouth went dry as cotton, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I'd locked the warehouse securely. The padlock had been intact when I arrived. No one else had a key. It was impossible for someone to have altered the floor overnight. I forced myself to approach the footprints, kneeling beside them with my camera. The impressions were identical to the day before, but unquestionably repositioned. I placed my hand inside one of the depressions, feeling its perfect contour. As my fingers traced the edge, I noticed something I'd missed previously: tiny cracks, radiating outward from each footprint, as if the concrete had fractured under enormous pressure. The metal detector confirmed what I already suspected. The jingling sounds had moved as well, now aligned with the new position of the footprints. But the noise had changed. It was louder now, more distinct. Not keys, I realized, but something, like small chains or links of metal striking together with each invisible step. I spent the day cataloging inventory in other areas of the warehouse, keeping my distance from the central corridor. My work suffered as my concentration repeatedly broke, attention drawn back to those impossible footprints. Several times, I thought I heard the jingling sound from across the warehouse, but when I paused to listen, only silence greeted me. That night, I researched the history of Warehouse 37. Construction had begun in 1922 and completed in 1924. The original railway company had gone bankrupt in 1931 during the Depression. Nothing remarkable stood out until I discovered a newspaper article from 1953 describing an industrial accident. A railway worker had become trapped between 2 cargo containers, the crushing pressure severing both his legs. The article mentioned he'd been wearing distinctive work boots with metal cleats and had carried the company's master keyring on his belt. He'd survived the accident but died years later in a psychiatric institution, reportedly tormented by phantom pains and insisting he could still feel his legs walking. The article included a photograph of the worker, and in the background, partially visible, was a wall of the warehouse with a painted sign, Storage Area 37. I didn't sleep that night. My mind churned with thoughts of amputated limbs that somehow continued to exist, of phantom sensations becoming material enough to leave impressions in solid concrete. I told myself it was absurd, a coincidence paired with my overactive imagination. Yet by morning, I found myself racing back to the warehouse before dawn, desperate to see if the footprints had moved again. They had another few inches closer to the exit. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Each morning, I would arrive to find the footprints had repositioned overnight, always moving toward the exit door. I calculated that at their current rate of movement, they would reach the exit in approximately 3 weeks. The jingling sound grew progressively louder, now audible without pressing my ear to the floor. Sometimes, in the periphery of my vision, I thought I caught glimpses of something dragging itself along the footprint path, a dark, low shape that vanished when I turned to look directly at it. My supervisor called to check on my progress. Concerned by the unusual length of time the inventory was taking, I fabricated excuses about disorganized paperwork and difficult to identify merchandise. In truth, I'd become obsessed with the footprints, spending hours documenting their movement, measuring the depth of the impressions, recording the jingling sounds. My notes filled page after page, becoming increasingly frantic and disordered. I began sleeping in my car outside the warehouse, unwilling to miss a single night's movement. On the 10th night, I decided to remain inside, hiding behind a stack of crates with a clear view of the central corridor. I brought a night vision camera, a digital recorder, and enough coffee to keep me awake until dawn. For hours, nothing happened. The warehouse creaked and settled, as old buildings do. Occasionally, a distant siren or passing vehicle broke the silence. My eyelids grew heavy despite the caffeine. Just as I began to drift off, around 3:17 a.m., according to my watch, the temperature in the warehouse plummeted. My breath clouded before me, and a bone-deep chill permeated my body. The jingling started, louder than I'd ever heard it before. Through the night vision camera, I watched the empty corridor, seeing nothing but the motionless footprints in the green-tinted display. Then, inexplicably, the concrete around the last footprint began to ripple, as if momentarily liquefied. Before my disbelieving eyes, the impression shifted backward several centimeters, the concrete solidifying instantly. Afterward, my hands shook so violently that the camera footage became unwatchable. I pressed myself against the crates, heart hammering so loudly I feared it would give away my position. To what, I couldn't say. There was nothing visible in the corridor, yet I felt with absolute certainty that I was not alone. A scraping sound drew my attention to the wall where the footprints originated. The brick surface appeared to bulge outward, as if something were pressing against it from the other side. The bulge took the shape of a hand, fingers splayed palm, flat against the wall. Then, impossibly, the hand impression sank into the solid brick, creating a perfect negative space. I fled, abandoning my equipment. I ran for the exit, fumbling with the keys as the jingling sound grew louder behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was home. With the doors locked and every light blazing, I called in sick. The next day, and the day after that, my supervisor became concerned enough to send a colleague to check on me. I refused to open the door, shouting through it that I had the flu and needed to be left alone. Eventually, facing the possibility of losing my job, I returned to work. The warehouse waited for me, looking exactly as it had before. Part of me hoped the footprints would be gone, that I had experienced some kind of mental break that had now passed. But they were still there, closer to the exit than ever, only about 10 feet away now. What choice did I have? I resumed my inventory. Work, cataloging boxes and crates, while keeping a wary distance from the central corridor. The jingling followed me now, no longer confined to the footprint path. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly behind me, stopping when I turned around. Other times it emanated from inside the very crates I was examining, ceasing the moment I opened them. 3 nights ago, the footprints reached the exit door. I arrived that morning to find the last impression half embedded in the concrete threshold. The door itself had changed. The previously rusted metal now displayed a hand-shaped depression in its center, as if someone had pushed against it with enormous force. Today, I submitted my final report. The inventory is complete, though I admit the last section was rushed, possibly containing errors. My supervisor seemed satisfied, noting only that I looked unwell and should consider taking some vacation time. I nodded absently, my mind on the warehouse and what would happen now that the footprints had reached their destination. Tonight, as I write this, I keep glancing toward my apartment door. Twice now, I've heard what sounds like jingling keys in the hallway outside, and on my way home, I noticed something on the sidewalk leading to my building, a faint impression in the concrete, roughly the size and shape of a work boot, sunken slightly below the surface. I'm leaving town tomorrow. I don't know where I'm going, only that I need to put distance between myself and Warehouse 37. Between myself and whatever followed those footprints out the exit door. Because I know, with terrible certainty, that it's not confined to the warehouse anymore. And I can't shake the feeling that it knows exactly where I live. Story 2. The first note struck me like a physical blow. A hollow, discordant sound that hung in the air long after the hammer had fallen back into place. There was something wrong with this piano. Something beyond mere mechanical failure or age. I've been tuning instruments for 23 years, and I've never felt a chill run down my spine from a single note. But this pianoforte, this ancient, ornate beast crouching in the corner of the dimly lit parlor, seemed to breathe the note rather than play it. And when the vibration finally died, the silence that followed was somehow worse. My name is Thomas Hargrove, and I restore pianos for a living. My specialty is historical instruments. The older and more complex, the better. That's why Robert Blackwood contacted me about the 1860 Broadwood pianoforte he'd inherited when he purchased the Elmwood estate, a crumbling Victorian mansion nestled high in the mountains where the fog never seems to lift. He'd offered triple my usual fee, plus accommodations for the week it would take to complete the restoration, a generous offer for an instrument that had likely been untouched for decades, possibly even a century. It needs to be perfect, Blackwood had insisted over the phone, his voice strangely tight. The previous owner was very particular about his instruments. It needs to be exactly as it was. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed for details about the piano's history, about why Blackwood seemed so desperate to have it working again. But the money was too good to pass up, and my curiosity about the rare model overcame my professional caution. The mansion came into view as I drove the final, winding stretch of mountain road, a looming shadow against the twilight sky, all sharp angles and peeling paint, windows like vacant eyes. The evening air bit through my coat as I stepped out of my car, carrying only my tools and a small overnight bag. Blackwood met me at the door, a tall, gaunt man with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He barely spoke as he led me through the cavernous entryway, past faded portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes following our progress across threadbare carpets. "The piano is in there," he said, pointing to a pair of double doors at the end of a long hallway. "I've had a room prepared for you upstairs. I'll be away on business until tomorrow evening. Please don't disturb anything else in the house." Before I could ask any questions, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the heavy front door slammed shut, alone in the mansion. I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. I pushed it aside. I had a job to do. The parlor was a time capsule, heavy velvet drapes, ornate furniture draped in white sheets, and in the corner by the tall windows, the piano. It was magnificent even in its decay. Rich mahogany with intricate carvings, brass pedals gleaming dully in the fading light. 7 unlit candles stood on its closed lid, arranged in a perfect semicircle. I didn't touch them. I set up my portable work lamp and began my initial assessment. The keys were yellowed with age, some cracked, others missing entirely. The strings were rusted, many broken. The felt hammers, moth-eaten and brittle. It would be a challenging restoration, but nothing I hadn't handled before. When I pressed the first key, expecting the dull thud of a dead note, I was startled by a soft hiss, like an exhale. A chill breeze seemed to emanate from between the keys, making the flames of my lamp flicker. I leaned closer, examining the action mechanism, when I noticed the candles on the lid trembling slightly. Though there was no draft in the closed room, I worked until well past midnight, removing the key slip to access the action. Each key I removed seemed unnaturally cold, as if carved from ice rather than ivory. When I finally decided to call it a night, my fingers were numb despite the warmth of the small space heater I'd set up. My room was on the 3rd floor, a sparse chamber with a narrow bed and a small writing desk. I fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of cascading scales played by invisible hands. I woke before dawn, covered in sweat despite the chill in the room. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound, I thought, though the house was now silent. I dressed quickly and returned to the parlor, drawn by an urgency I couldn't explain. The pianoforte waited in the gray morning light, looking almost predatory in the shadows. I resumed my work, carefully removing the rusted strings, replacing them one by one. Each string I tightened seemed to respond differently than any piano I'd worked on before. Instead of the gradual increase in pitch as I turned the tuning hammer, the notes would suddenly jump to perfect pitch, as if guided by an unseen hand. And each perfectly tuned string would vibrate softly on its own for several seconds afterward, sustaining without being struck. By midday I had restored the middle register. That's when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the instrument. I froze, tuning hammer in hand, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable, a steady beat like a heart, in 4/4 time, emanating from the upward. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, or perhaps water pipes in the walls. But when I placed my hand on the pianoforte side, I felt the vibration, a pulse, warm and organic, beneath the cold, polished wood. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become, how my own heart was racing to match the rhythm coming from the instrument. The 7 candles on the lid, though unlit, began to flicker, as if caught in a breeze. But the air in the room was still, heavy with dust and the faint smell of beeswax. I forced myself to continue working. As I moved to the bass strings, the heart-like thumping grew louder, more insistent. When I struck a low C to check my tuning, the note lingered, then slowly bent upward to C hash. Without my touch, I backed away, watching in disbelief as the hammers began to move on their own, ever so slightly, as if being pressed by phantom fingers. I needed air. I stumbled out of the parlor, down the long hallway to the front door, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pushed, pulled, even threw my shoulder against the heavy oak, but it remained firmly shut, as if sealed by something stronger than locks. Panic rose in my throat as I tried window after window, finding each one immovable. I was trapped inside with nightfall approaching, and Blackwood not due back until evening. I returned to the parlor, reluctantly, drawn by the soft, insistent music now emanating from the pianoforte, a slow, melancholy melody I didn't recognize. Played so softly it might have been coming from another room. But there was no one else in the house, and the hammers were still. I approached cautiously, my skin crawling with goose flesh despite the sweat beading on my forehead. The melody continued, growing slightly louder as I came nearer. It wasn't the hammer striking the strings. It was the strings themselves, vibrating without being struck, playing a composition that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sorrow. I needed to understand what was happening. My rational mind grasped for explanations, resonance from somewhere else in the house, a trick of acoustics, my own exhaustion playing tricks on me. I knelt beside the instrument, pressing my ear against its side. The music stopped abruptly. In its place, the heartbeat returned, louder now, perfectly steady. And then a voice, or something like a voice, whispered from within the wooden chamber. "You've brought me back. Now you must play." I recoiled, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. The candles on the lid suddenly ignited, 7 flames burning, tall and straight, casting long shadows across the parlor floor. The lid of the pianoforte slowly raised itself, revealing the newly strung interior, strings gleaming like fresh surgical sutures. My legs trembled as I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath visible in the sudden cold. The heartbeat from the piano grew louder, faster, the wood of the case expanding and contracting like a chest rising and falling. Blackwood had said the previous owner was particular about his instruments. He'd said it needed to be exactly as it was. What he hadn't mentioned was why. I spent the next hours huddled in the corner of the parlor, watching as the pianoforte occasionally played short phrases. Never a complete piece, just fragments, like a musician trying to remember a long-forgotten composition. The candles burned but never diminished, their flames dancing in perfect synchronization with the music. As twilight deepened outside the tall windows, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Blackwood had returned. I rushed to the parlor door, pounding on it, shouting for help. The footsteps paused outside the door. "Mr. Blackwood, the piano, there's something wrong with it. Please, let me out." His voice came through the door, calm and detached. He said he couldn't do that, not until the restoration was complete. The maestro needed his instrument, he explained. The maestro had been waiting so long, trapped in silence. Blackwood's grandfather had promised to maintain the instrument, but after his death, no one had kept that promise. Until now. I demanded to know what he meant, my voice breaking with fear. His answer chilled me more than the cold emanating from the pianoforte. The maestro had been a brilliant composer, he said, but his true genius lay in finding ways to preserve his consciousness beyond death. He'd constructed the pianoforte himself, incorporating materials that Blackwood would not specify. When he felt death approaching, he'd performed a ritual, binding himself to the instrument. But over the decades, the piano had deteriorated, weakening the connection. The maestro needed it restored to continue his great work. He just needs a conductor now, Blackwood said, his voice fading as he moved away from the door. Someone with the right hands. He chose you, Mr. Hargrove. Your reputation precedes you. Left alone again with the increasingly active instrument, I watched in horror as the keys began to depress on their own, playing a complex progression of chords. The heartbeat sound had synchronized perfectly with my own racing pulse. The air from between the keys had become a cold wind, carrying the scent of decay and something metallic, like old blood. I had to finish the restoration. It was the only way out. With trembling hands, I returned to my work, installing the remaining strings, adjusting the action. Each completed section caused the invisible presence in the room to grow stronger. The temperature continued to drop until ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows. My fingers moved mechanically, driven by terror and the desperate hope that completing the job would mean my release. As I tuned the final string, a high A, at the upper end of the keyboard, the entire instrument shuddered violently. The candles flared, their flames reaching nearly to the ceiling. The pianoforte's case expanded and contracted rapidly, like a creature gasping for air. Then, silence fell, complete and absolute. In that silence, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a physical manifestation of the entity that had been trapped in the instrument. But there was nothing visible, only a displacement of the air, a density to the shadows that suggested a human form. The keys began to move again, playing a complex, beautiful piece I'd never heard before. The invisible presence moved to stand beside me, and I felt a cold pressure on my shoulder, like a hand resting there. The voice from within the pianoforte spoke again, clearer now. Sit, play with me. I found myself moving to the bench, sitting before the keyboard. My hands hovered over the keys, shaking uncontrollably. The cold pressure guided my right hand to the keys, pressing my fingers down to play a simple melody. The left hand followed, adding harmony. I wasn't playing. It was playing through me, using my hands as its own. I could feel it entering me. Through my fingertips, a cold, ancient consciousness seeping into my mind like water into parched soil. Memories that weren't mine flashed behind my eyes. Concerts in grand European halls. Compositions scratched onto parchment by candlelight. A dark ritual performed as death approached. With what remained of my own will, I fought against it, trying to pull my hands away from the keys. The pressure on my shoulders increased, becoming painful. The voice hissed in my ear, no longer coming from the instrument but from inside my own head. We will make music that will last forever. Your hands are mine now. In desperation, I slammed the keyboard lid down on my own fingers. The pain was excruciating, but it broke the entity's concentration. I felt its grip on my mind loosened slightly, enough for me to stagger away from the bench. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness, except for the faint moonlight through the windows. In that moment of freedom, I understood what I needed to do. This wasn't about completing the restoration. It was about reversing it. With my uninjured hand, I grabbed my wire cutters from my tool bag and lunged for the pianoforte. The invisible force slammed me against the wall, but I fought through the pressure, crawling back to the instrument. The heartbeat sound had become erratic, frantic. I reached the piano and, with a strength born of terror, tore at the strings I had so carefully installed, severing them one by one. Each broken string released a high-pitched wail, like a scream. The temperature in the room fluctuated wildly, freezing cold one moment, stifling hot the next. The invisible presence thrashed around the room, overturning furniture, shattering the windows. I continued cutting strings until my hands were sliced and bleeding, the pain in my crushed fingers almost unbearable. But with each string I cut, the entity's power seemed to diminish. The heartbeat grew fainter, irregular. When I cut the final string, that high A had just tuned, an unearthly howl filled the room. A sound of such despair and rage that I curled into a ball on the floor, covering my ears. The pianoforte gave one final violent shudder, then split down the middle, its wooden case cracking open like a rib cage. Silence fell again, but different this time. Normal, natural silence, not the dense fabric-like quiet from before. The presence was gone. I could feel its absence in the air, which no longer carried that unnatural chill. The parlor door swung open on its own. Cradling my injured hand, I stumbled out into the hallway. The front door stood open as well, revealing the night sky beyond. I didn't stop to gather my tools or belongings. I ran to my car and drove down the mountain road, in the darkness, my headlights cutting through the fog. I never returned to Elmwood, never answered Blackwood's increasingly threatening phone calls, never collected my fee. My crushed fingers healed, but not properly. My career as a piano tuner is over. I can't bring myself to touch a keyboard, can't even stand to hear piano music on the radio. Sometimes, at night, as I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear faint notes, playing at the edge of my consciousness, fragments of a composition so beautiful it makes my heart ache. And underneath those notes, always, a faint heartbeat, in perfect 4/4 time. I wake from these episodes gasping for air, my fingers moving, of their own accord, as if playing invisible keys. And though I've moved 3 times since that night at Elmwood, I keep finding small things out of place in my apartment. A book moved from where I left it, a chair turned slightly, and most disturbing of all, my alarm clock occasionally reset, to play it precisely for 44 a.m. I don't own a piano. But sometimes, in the silence of my room, I swear I can hear one being tuned. Story 3. The first time I heard the ocean inside my office, I was already too late. The cylinder had chosen me, not the other way around, and what flows from water to paper to mind cannot be undone. Some maps aren't meant to be read. They're meant to read you. The package arrived on a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the lack of return address. A weathered cardboard box containing a brass cap cylinder, about 18 inches long, wrapped in what appeared to be sailcloth so old it had gone brittle. There was no note, just an envelope containing a deed of gift, transferring ownership to me, Benjamin Harlow, senior cartographer at Northwestern Geographical Institute. The signature at the bottom was a precise, spidery scroll that spelled out a thorn collector, nothing more. I specialize in historical oceanic cartography. My office walls are lined with antique projections of the Pacific, forgotten shipping, routes and islands that have since disappeared beneath rising seas. This cylinder was simply another artifact to catalog, or so I thought. What professional wouldn't be curious? The brass cap resisted at first, then yielded with a peculiar sigh. That raised the hairs on my forearms. The seal beneath it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. A transparent disc that caught the light like a frozen droplet, thin enough to see the yellowed parchment through it. Not wax, not resin, but something with the refraction of glass, and the fluidity of water, somehow suspended in time. When I pressed my fingernail against it, it yielded slightly before springing back. My colleague, Marcus, poked his head in, asking about a symposium deadline. I barely registered his words, my attention fixed on that impossible seal. After he left, I took a brass letter opener and carefully worked it under the edge of the transparent disc. It parted with a soft sound, like water receding from sand. The parchment inside slid out with surprising ease, unrolling onto my desk with a rustling whisper. The map that unfurled before me was exquisite, hand-drawn in sepia ink on parchment that felt impossibly soft under my fingers. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard maritime chart of the South Pacific, circa mid-19th century, judging by the projection style. But as I leaned closer, adjusting my glasses, something shifted beneath my gaze. An island, small, roughly crescent-shaped, seemed to elongate slightly, as if breathing. I blinked, attributing the illusion to eye strain. Then it happened again. The coastline pulsed, expanded by perhaps a millimeter, then contracted. My heartbeat quickened as I forced myself to look away, then back again. This time, I didn't blink. The southern peninsula of the island visibly stretched, like watching continental drift in real time. Sweat beaded at my temples. 20 years studying historical maps, and I'd never experienced such a vivid hallucination. I reached for my phone to photograph the anomaly, but the screen showed nothing but ordinary parchment. No movement, no pulsation. Through the camera, the map was perfectly normal. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I set the map down and went to splash cold water on my face in the small bathroom adjoining my office. When I returned, the cylinder had somehow rotated 180 on my desk. More troubling was the seal. The water glass disc I had broken was back. In place, intact, as if never disturbed. I approached cautiously, picking up the cylinder to examine it. The seal appeared completely undamaged. When I rotated the tube, a sound like distant waves breaking on shore emanated from inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I used the letter opener again to break the seal, which parted with the same aqueous sigh. This time, a different map slid out, this one showing a section of coastline I didn't immediately recognize. The cartographic style was similar, but the landforms were unfamiliar. As I studied it, I noticed tiny notations along the shore, inscribed in minute handwriting. I retrieved my magnifying glass to examine them. Where the drowned walk at midnight. Here, the tide runs backward. Entry point, spring tide, new moon. My mouth went dry. These weren't standard navigational notes. They more closely resembled warnings or instructions. As I moved the magnifying glass across the parchment, I noticed something else. The ink wasn't actually sepia, but a deep, rusty red-brown that glinted with an almost metallic sheen under the light. The overhead fluorescents flickered momentarily. When they stabilized, I noticed the map had changed again. A small archipelago that hadn't been present before now dotted the western edge of the chart. My hands began to tremble as I set the magnifying glass down, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I carefully rolled the map back into the cylinder, noticing as I did that my fingertips left no marks on the parchment. It accepted no oils, no impressions, as if it existed just slightly out of phase with the world around it. When I replaced the brass cap, I heard that sound again, water receding over pebbles. I set the cylinder in my desk drawer and locked it, pocketing the key. That night, sleep evaded me. My apartment felt suffocating despite the open windows, the air thick and saline. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I surrendered to insomnia and returned to my office, telling myself I needed to properly catalog the artifact before presenting it to the Institute's conservation team. The security guard nodded as I signed in, commenting on my dedication. If only he knew, the compulsion driving me wasn't academic fervor, but something closer to obsession. My hands shook as I unlocked my office door. The smell hit me first, brine and decay like a tidal flat at low ebb. My desk lamp illuminated a bizarre scene. Dozens of tiny droplets, perfectly spherical and transparent like miniature glass beads, were arranged across my desktop in a precise pattern. They caught the light like dewdrops, but didn't roll or merge. When I hesitantly touched one, they were solid, cool to the touch, yet appeared liquid. The drawer where I'd locked the cylinder was still secured, the key still in my pocket. Yet, the drops formed what was unmistakably a coordinate grid. At each intersection point sat one of the glass water droplets, and connecting them revealed the outline of an island chain I'd never seen on any map. My breath fogged in the suddenly chilled air, as I used a ruler to measure the distances between the droplets, converting to a standard Mercator projection. I plotted the coordinates on my computer, according to every database and satellite image available. These points marked empty ocean between New Zealand and Antarctica, a notorious stretch of the Southern Ocean devoid of land, yet the pattern was unmistakable and familiar. It matched the archipelago that had appeared on the second map, the one that hadn't been there initially. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable rush and retreat of waves, as if the tide were ebbing. From somewhere behind my bookcase, the sound grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a whispering that skittered at the edges of comprehension. I spun around, searching for the source. But my office door remained closed, the windows securely latched. The drawer containing the cylinder rattled, the lock turning of its own accord. I stumbled backward as the drawer slid open silently. The cylinder rolled forward and fell to the floor with a thud that seemed to reverberate far longer than it should have. The brass cap unscrewed itself before my eyes, falling away to reveal the water glass seal, glowing with a pale blue phosphorescence. My legs gave way as I collapsed into my chair, unable to tear my gaze from the spectacle. The seal dissolved with a sound like a sigh, and parchment spilled forth, unrolling across the floor of its own volition. This map was different, larger, more detailed, and unmistakably showing a coastline I recognized, the eastern seaboard of Massachusetts, where I'd grown up, but superimposed over familiar harbors and bays were those strange islands from before, as if they existed in the same space but a different plane. My computer chimed, startling me. An automatic email notification from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Unusual tidal anomalies reported along eastern seaboard. Academic inquiry. The email detailed unprecedented fluctuations in sea level recordings at multiple stations, defying both lunar cycles and weather patterns. The phenomenon had begun exactly 24 hours after the cylinder had arrived on my desk. The room temperature plummeted. I could see my breath clouding before me as frost patterns, remarkably similar to coastlines, formed on my computer screen. The whispering grew louder, resolving into words I could almost understand. Something about gates opening, something about water finding its level, something about maps that draw themselves. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly fell. From my chair, it was Marcus, his voice tense and confused. He asked if I was seeing the news about the coastal anomalies. Before I could respond, he mentioned that the Institute had received inquiries from government agencies about historical precedents for such phenomena. Then he asked hesitantly if I'd made any progress with that cylinder thing. I hadn't told anyone about the cylinder. Cold sweat drenched my shirt as I stammered some excuse and ended the call. My gaze returned to the map on the floor, where the ink now glistened wetly, as if freshly applied. The archipelago of impossible islands had grown larger, spreading across the familiar coastline like an infection. I grabbed the edge of the parchment, intending to roll it up and return it to the cylinder, but the moment my fingers touched it, images flooded my mind. Vast underwater cities with architecture that defied Euclidean geometry. Beings that swam through both water and land as if they were identical mediums. And maps, countless maps, covering the walls of a circular chamber, each one showing a different version of Earth's oceans. My hands came away wet, not with water, but with something that refracted light like the seal had, as if reality itself had become liquid at the point of contact. The droplets clung to my fingertips, impossible to wipe away. I staggered to the bathroom, desperate to wash whatever this was from my skin, but the faucet yielded not water but sand, fine and gray, pouring endlessly into the sink. In the mirror, my reflection rippled as if viewed through disturbed water. Back in my office, the map had changed again. Now it showed my exact location. The Institute, my office, even my name written in that same spidery handwriting. But surrounding the building was no longer Cambridge, but open water, with those impossible islands encircling the structure like predators. The sound of waves grew deafening. Water began seeping under my door, not flooding in, but rising impossibly from the floor itself, forming a perfectly even layer that spread across the room without touching my shoes. It was an inch deep then too, yet I remained dry despite standing in the middle of it. The water was a medium, not a physical presence, a translation layer between realities. In that moment of clarity, I understood what the cylinder truly was. Not a container for maps, but a key, a tool for repositioning geographical realities. The cartographer doesn't just document the world, he helps define it. These maps weren't representations but alterations, each one shifting something fundamental about the relationship between land and sea. The cylinder rolled across the floor, coming to rest against my foot. The water glass seal had reformed again, glowing more intensely now. My hands moved of their own accord, picking it up, feeling its strange weight. I understood with perfect clarity that I had choices. Break the seal again and allow whatever was happening to continue. Or I looked back at my computer screen, now showing satellite imagery of the eastern coastline. Meteorologists were baffled by pressure systems that didn't behave according to known physics. Coastal communities reported tides that came in but didn't retreat. With trembling hands, I raised the cylinder above my head and brought it down hard against the edge of my desk. The brass dented but held. Again, I struck it, again and again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. On the seventh blow, a crack appeared along the cylinder's length. The water beneath my feet surged violently, splashing up to my knees, though I remained inexplicably dry. The crack widened, spilling forth not parchment but pure light, blinding in its intensity. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo of rage or pain. I couldn't tell which. My ears popped as if I'd descended to crushing depths. Then, silence, complete and absolute. When my vision cleared, my office was dry. The cylinder lay broken on the floor, empty. The maps, the glass water droplets, all gone. Only a faint smell of salt remained. I've checked every scientific database, every maritime report. The coastal anomalies ceased at the exact moment I broke the cylinder. No trace remains of the impossible islands, at least not in any conventional record. But my dreams are now filled with underwater spires and non-Euclidean architecture. When I shower, the water forms momentary patterns on the tile that look like coastlines I've never seen. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of transparent, water-like droplets forming coordinates on my desk. Most disturbing of all, the scars on my hands from breaking the cylinder weep not blood but clear fluid that hardens into glass like beads. And each night, I swear the sound of waves grows louder in my apartment, though I live 30 miles inland. The cylinder may be destroyed, but I fear the key has merged with the keymaster. I've begun drawing my own maps now, compulsively, maps of places that cannot exist. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I hear a whispering that grows more intelligible by the day. The map is not the territory. The map creates the territory, and the water always finds its level. Story for and. The first time I saw the water moving upward, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. The fluorescent tubes in the third sublevel garage had always flickered, unpredictably casting strange shadows across the polished concrete floor. But when I crouched down and watched a puddle shrink from the bottom up, droplets lifting off the surface like gravity had suddenly reversed its grip, I felt the first cold fingers of dread wrap around my spine. My phone's camera captured what my mind refused to process: a fine mist enveloping the luxury vehicles, rotating clockwise with unnatural precision, making the chrome logos and license plates glow with a phosphorescent light that shouldn't exist. 3 levels beneath the earth. As property manager of the Obsidian, Milwaukee's most exclusive underground condominium complex, I dealt with flooding, electrical failures, and the occasional entitled resident. But nothing had prepared me for what was happening in the lowest level of our parking structure. The humidity sensors had gone haywire 2 days ago, displaying negative readings that the maintenance crew dismissed as faulty equipment. Being thorough was my reputation, the reason I'd been hired to oversee this $200 million subterranean marvel. So I'd come down alone at 2 a.m. to investigate. Now, I wished I hadn't. My breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air as I moved between the rows of BMWs, Teslas, and Maseratis. The concrete pillars seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, as though breathing in perfect rhythm with the swirling mist. The security cameras mounted overhead had captured the phenomenon for 3 consecutive nights. But the footage had been dismissed as digital artifacts or condensation on the lenses. Those explanations felt hollow as I watched another puddle begin to lift, drop by drop, toward the ceiling. The maintenance staff had reported strange noises coming from the ventilation system. Metallic clicks and low, resonant hums. But nothing, like the sound that now filled my ears, a wet, crackling static that reminded me of ice breaking on a winter lake. Each drop that ascended made a tiny snap as it struck the fluorescent tubes overhead, like raindrops hitting hot metal in reverse. I raised my phone to take another photo when the screen went black. The battery had been at 87% just moments before. A viscous bead of sweat rolled down my neck as I pocketed the useless device and tried to silence my accelerating heartbeat. The elevators were 50 yards away, past 3 more rows of cars, and the electrical substation that powered this level. Just walk, don't run. There's a logical explanation. My shoes squeaked against the concrete as I moved, each step echoing unnaturally. In the cavernous space, the building plans had highlighted the obsidian's revolutionary dampening technology, a cutting-edge system designed to isolate each floor from external vibrations and sound. But now, every footfall reverberated as if the garage were expanding with each step. Then I saw them, footprints forming on the dry concrete ahead of me. Not from someone walking. These appeared from nowhere, materializing as though an invisible presence were approaching. Wet impressions shimmering under the fluorescent lights. Perfectly formed heel-to-toe imprints that stopped precisely 12 feet from where I stood, frozen. My throat constricted as a cold sweat broke across my forehead. The logical part of my brain searched desperately for explanations. Water seeping up through the concrete. Some bizarre pressure phenomenon. An elaborate prank by residents who resented the recent increase in maintenance fees. None of these thoughts could explain why the impressions began to dry from the bottom up. Just like the puddles. The garage had 5 emergency exits, each leading to reinforced stairwells, designed to withstand anything short of a nuclear attack. The nearest was behind me, perhaps 30 yards. I backed away from the vanishing footprints, my peripheral vision catching glimpses of movement around the luxury vehicles. The mist had thickened, forming distinct tendrils that coiled around side view, mirrors and antenna bases. Each car now sat in its own cocoon of swirling vapor, the logos and license plates glowing more intensely than before. A Mercedes emblem pulsed like a tiny blue star, its light reflecting off the droplets rising from beneath it. The rhythmic glow matched my racing pulse, or perhaps my heart had synchronized with it without my conscious awareness. The thought made me dizzy, and I steadied myself against a concrete pillar, jerking my hand away when I felt its surface vibrating with a subtle current. The obsidian had been marketed as the future of luxury living, a haven for the wealthy seeking escape from Milwaukee's increasingly extreme weather events. 3 levels underground, we were supposed to be isolated from the outside world's chaos. What if we dug too deep? What if we breached something that should have remained sealed? The property developers had been suspiciously vague about what had occupied this downtown site before construction began. Old newspaper archives had mentioned a research facility in the 1970s, but specific details were surprisingly scarce. Our geological surveys had shown unusual mineral deposits beneath the site. Nothing dangerous, just anomalous formations that required special construction techniques. These thoughts raced through my mind as I backed toward the emergency exit, unable to tear my eyes away from the intensifying phenomenon. The rising droplets had increased in number, hundreds now lifting simultaneously across the garage floor. They moved faster now, striking the ceiling with audible impacts that formed a discordant percussion. The humidity readout on the wall, which had registered negative numbers for days, now displayed rapidly changing symbols that resembled no numerical system I recognized. My back finally struck the emergency exit's push bar, but the door didn't budge. I spun around and shoved with both hands, the metal cold enough to burn my palms. The electronic lock showed green. It should have opened, but the door remained fixed, as though welded shut from the other side. Panic surged through my chest as I slammed my shoulder against it repeatedly, each impact sending shock waves of pain down my arm. The crackling sounds intensified behind me. When I turned, the mist had changed. No longer content to swirl around individual vehicles, it now flowed between them, forming currents and eddies that moved with disturbing purpose. The phosphorescent glow had spread from the metal emblems to outline entire cars, creating ghostly duplicates that hovered inches above their solid counterparts. My mind flashed to the recent complaints from residents, unexplained power fluctuations, electronics failing without cause, persistent low-frequency hums that disrupted sleep. Management had blamed the city's aging power grid and promised to install additional filters. We dismissed reports of disorientation and momentary memory lapses as symptoms of the residents' advancing age. The average obsidian dweller was over 60, wealthy enough to afford our astronomical fees. What if they'd been experiencing genuine effects from whatever was happening here? The third sublevel had always been colder than the ones above it, a fact our engineers attributed to its proximity to the water table. They'd installed additional dehumidifiers after residents complained about condensation on their vehicles. Those units had failed spectacularly last week. Their circuits fused in ways our maintenance team couldn't explain. Another emergency exit waited on the far side of the garage. I pushed away from the locked door and began moving along the perimeter wall, keeping my back to the concrete. The mist parted before me like a sentient entity, forming a corridor that both invited and threatened. My legs trembled with each step, muscles tensed for flight even as I forced myself to move deliberately. The fluorescent tubes overhead were changing color, their sterile white light gradually shifting toward a pale blue that reminded me of deep water ice. The temperature continued to drop, my breath forming thicker clouds with each exhale. The concrete floor beneath my feet no longer felt solid. Each step produced a subtle give, as though I were walking across a membrane rather than engineered stone. I'd nearly reached the midpoint of the garage when I heard it, a low, resonant tone that vibrated through my chest cavity. Not mechanical, not electronic, but something organic and vast. The sound pulsed in perfect sync with the glowing emblems, which now blinked like beacons across the darkening space. My phone vibrated in my pocket, impossible given its dead battery. I pulled it out to find the screen illuminated with the same symbols now displayed on the humidity sensor. The camera activated without my input, lens focusing on the center of the garage, where the mist now formed a perfect cylinder extending from floor to ceiling. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself moving toward it. Not by choice, my legs carried me forward as though pulled by unseen hands. The mist parted around me, cold tendrils brushing against my face with the texture of wet silk. The garage lights dimmed further, until only the phosphorescent glow of the vehicle emblems provided illumination. Their pulsing intensifying with each step I took. At the center of the garage, directly beneath the main ventilation shaft, the concrete floor had changed. What had been solid now rippled like the surface of a pond, concentric circles expanding outward from a central point. Yet it remained solid beneath my feet, a contradiction my mind struggled to reconcile. The air pressure changed abruptly, my ears popping painfully as a vacuum seemed to form around me. The rising droplets accelerated, no longer individual beads, but continuous streams flowing upward with increasing force. My hair stood on end, not from static electricity, but pulled toward the ceiling as though gravity itself had reversed. That's when I understood what was happening, or at least what my terrified mind could rationalize. The boundary between our world and something else had thinned in this place, whether through the unique mineral composition beneath the building, the specific depth of our excavation, or some cosmic alignment I couldn't comprehend. The obsidian had been built at a juncture where physical laws became malleable. The residents' complaints suddenly made horrible sense. The memory lapses, the disorientation, the persistent fatigue, all symptoms of existing in a space where reality itself was unstable. We'd dismissed an elderly resident's claim that she'd seen her late husband standing at the foot of her bed, his form composed of what she described as luminous mist. Another had reported waking to find his bedroom mirror reflecting a version of his condominium that was architecturally identical but composed of blue-black stone that seemed to absorb light. My phone screen flashed brightly, the incomprehensible symbols now arranging themselves into recognizable patterns that still conveyed no meaning my conscious mind could grasp. Yet some deeper part of me responded, a primal recognition that sent waves of cold dread cascading through my body. These weren't random glitches. They were communication attempts. The cylindrical formation of mist began to narrow at its center, constricting like an hourglass or the pupil of an enormous eye adjusting to light. Within the constriction, darkness gathered, not the absence of light, but something more fundamental, a void that suggested the absence of everything our reality contained. My body trembled uncontrollably now, not from cold, but from proximity to something my mind couldn't process. Primitive survival instincts screamed for flight, but my muscles refused to respond. I remained fixed in place while the darkness within. The mist took form, not solid, not even properly visible, but undeniably present. It unfurled like a flower composed of negative space, each petal extending outward before folding back in complex geometry. The movement created patterns that hurt to observe, angles that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, overlapping and intersecting. My vision blurred as tears streamed down my face, my brain's desperate attempt to protect itself from what it was being forced to witness. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in sensations that bypassed my ears and materialized directly in my consciousness. Cold pressure against my thoughts, probing tendrils that slithered through memories and emotions with clinical detachment. Images flashed before me, the obsidian's foundation being poured over strange mineral formations, engineers noting anomalous readings, but proceeding under pressure from investors. The first residents reporting dreams of submersion. In luminous blue depths, these weren't my memories. They belonged to the building itself, or to whatever had awakened beneath it. The pressure in my mind intensified, sorting through my knowledge of the building systems, ventilation that connected all three sublevels, water pipes that ran through central columns, electrical conduits that formed a grid beneath the concrete. Floors I understood with sudden, horrifying clarity that it was learning our infrastructure, mapping pathways through which it could spread. With tremendous effort, I managed to raise my arm, fingers trembling as I activated my phone's flash. The bright LED cut through the mist, momentarily disrupting the perfect formation. The pressure in my mind receded slightly, the entity recoiling from the simple technology, not from the light itself, I realized, but from the abrupt change, the introduction of chaotic elements into its carefully orchestrated emergence. Chaos, disruption, randomness, these were anathema to whatever was attempting to manifest. The realization gave me enough mental freedom to take one stumbling step backward, breaking the perfect alignment it had established. The mist swirled in agitation, the phosphorescent glow intensifying around the vehicles, as though in response to anger or frustration. I remembered the building's emergency protocols, specifically the fire suppression system. The third garage used a high-pressure water mist system rather than traditional sprinklers, more effective for vehicle fires and less damaging to the luxury cars. The control panel was mounted near the electrical substation, 20 yards away. Each step away from the central manifestation became easier than the last, as though its influence weakened with distance, or its attention had turned elsewhere. I moved, as quickly as my trembling legs allowed, navigating between vehicles whose emblems now pulsed with angry red light. The suppression system's control panel required a key I carried on my ring, standard procedure for the property manager. My fingers felt numb as I fumbled with the lock, the key slipping from my sweat-slicked hand twice before I managed to insert it. The panel opened to reveal a simple interface, system status indicators, and a large red button protected by a plastic cover. Behind me, the mist formation had begun to collapse, the cylindrical structure giving way to chaotic swirls that expanded outward with increasing speed. The darkness at its center remained, but now it stretched and distorted, reaching tendrils toward me with unmistakable purpose. The vehicle emblems flashed in furious patterns, their glow intensifying until the logos seemed to detach from the cars themselves, hovering inches above the metal surfaces. I flipped the plastic cover and slammed my palm against the red button. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, the ceiling erupted with a deafening hiss as thousands of high-pressure nozzles activated simultaneously, filling the garage with a fine water mist that fell downward, natural, proper, obeying the physical laws that should never have been violated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the manifestation. Where the falling water met the rising droplets, tiny flashes of blue-white light erupted like miniature lightning strikes. The mist formation collapsed entirely, the darkness at its center shuddering violently before fragmenting into smaller voids that winked out of existence, one by one. The phosphorescent glow faded from the vehicle emblems, returning them to mundane metal and plastic. The swirling mist thinned and dissipated, leaving only the artificial fog of the fire suppression system. The temperature rose rapidly, returning to the garage's normal cool dampness, rather than the bone-deep cold that had pervaded it moments before. I stood trembling beside the control panel, as the water continued to fall, soaking through my clothes and washing away the cold sweat of terror. My phone screen had returned to normal, battery indicator showing 87% as though nothing had happened. The humidity sensor on the wall displayed a perfectly reasonable 68%, high due to the activated sprinklers, but no longer negative or displaying incomprehensible symbols. When the water finally shut off automatically after its programmed 5-minute cycle, I remained motionless, listening intently for any sign that the phenomenon persisted. The garage was silent save for water dripping from cars and ceiling, following gravity's proper direction. The fluorescent lights had returned to their normal white glow, revealing nothing but an empty parking garage and a lot of wet luxury vehicles. I knew I should document everything, file reports, perhaps evacuate the building until a thorough investigation could be conducted. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me this prestigious position, began constructing explanations. A gas leak causing hallucinations, stress-induced perceptual distortions, perhaps even a minor stroke that had affected my vision and cognition. But deeper down, where primal instincts resided, I understood what had happened. The obsidian had been built at a place where the membrane between worlds had grown thin. Our excavation, our presence, our electromagnetic systems had created conditions that allowed something to begin crossing over. The water, natural, flowing according to proper physical laws, had disrupted its attempt. But for how long? I made my way to the elevator, each step splashing through puddles that remained firmly on the ground. As the doors closed and the car began its ascent, I noticed small droplets of water on the ceiling. They clung there unnaturally, defying gravity, in a way that might be dismissed as capillary action or surface tension, but I knew better. I watched as one droplet detached and began to rise toward the light fixture overhead, followed by another and another. Whatever had begun in the third sublevel was spreading upward, following the paths I'd inadvertently revealed through my knowledge of the building systems. It was learning, adapting, finding new ways to manipulate our reality. The fire suppression system had disrupted its manifestation but hadn't stopped its influence. As property manager of the Obsidian, I had access to the building's complete blueprints, maintenance schedules, and resident information. I knew every system, every weakness, every potential point of failure. In trying to understand what was happening, I had given it everything it needed. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby level. Through the glass walls that surrounded the Obsidian's atrium, I could see rain falling outside. Normal, natural. Rain obeying the fundamental laws of our world. But as I stepped into the silent lobby, I noticed small puddles forming on the marble floor beneath perfectly dry ceiling tiles. And in those puddles, tiny droplets beginning to rise. Story 5. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was fatigue. The second time, I blamed the dim lighting and my aging eyes. By the third time, I couldn't deny that something was fundamentally wrong with the Bellamy Theater, or with me. The renovation project was only in its second week when I began to notice that the grand staircase in the central vestibule didn't behave like stairs should. Architecture isn't supposed to rebel against the laws of physics. Yet here I was, clutching a brass railing that seemed alive beneath my palm, my footsteps betrayed by wood that pushed back. I never wanted this job. Interim watchman at a Art Nouveau theater wasn't exactly on my career vision board. But after the layoffs at the manufacturing plant, and 3 months of rejected applications, I needed something, anything, to keep the creditors at bay. The Bellamy's owners needed someone on site overnight while the daytime crews renovated the once grand performance hall. A simple arrangement, 12 hours of solitude, a thermos of coffee, and rounds every 2 hours to check for burst pipes or signs of break-ins. The pay was modest but immediate, nothing to it. The project manager had assured me with a dismissive wave, handing over a ring of antiquated keys that weighed heavy in my pocket. Just keep the vagrants out and make sure nothing catches fire. He hadn't mentioned the stairs, of course, or the lamps, or the whispers. The Bellamy had been the crown jewel of downtown when it opened in 1911, hosting opera companies and vaudeville acts before declining into a second-run movie house and finally closing 20 years ago. Its facade still maintained a stubborn elegance, with sinuous metal details and stained glass that caught the afternoon light, artistic flourishes from an era Before function crushed form. Inside, decades of neglect had transformed grandeur into decay, peeling gilt, water-stained plaster, and the perpetual smell of mildew that no amount of industrial cleaners could mask. My first week passed uneventfully. I patrolled with my flashlight, documented minor issues for the day crew, and spent the quiet hours reading paperbacks in the manager's office. I avoided the theater's auditorium, with its gaping stage and rows of seats shrouded in drop cloths like patient ghosts. The place felt melancholy but ordinary. I was even starting to appreciate the solitude after years on a noisy factory floor. Then came Monday of the second week. I was making my 2 a.m. rounds when I decided to check the upper balcony, where workers had been reinforcing railings. I approached the central staircase, a sweeping wooden curve that dominated the vestibule, and began my ascent. 6 steps up, a curious sensation overtook me. Despite continuing to climb, I felt a subtle resistance, as if walking against an invisible current. My legs grew unreasonably heavy. The handrail seemed to glide the wrong way under my grip, creating the distinct impression that I was descending. While climbing, vertigo seized me. I stopped, closed my eyes, and took several deep breaths. When I looked again, I was somehow 2 steps lower than where I'd stopped. I attributed it to misperception in the poor light, and pressed on, gripping the railing tighter. The sensation intensified. The tread seemed to push against my feet with a gentle centrifugal force, like a reversed escalator. My heart pounded as I struggled upward against resistance that shouldn't exist. After what felt like climbing 20 steps, far more than the actual number, I finally reached the mezzanine level, sweating and disoriented. I told myself it was an inner ear issue, perhaps the start of a viral infection. I even made a doctor's appointment for the following week, yet when I descended an hour later, new impossibilities awaited. The stairs, which had fought my ascent, now seemed eager to accelerate my descent. Each step down was slightly shorter than the previous, creating a sickening sensation of falling much further than the actual distance. By the time I should have reached the ground floor, I was convinced I'd descended well into some non-basement level. Panic bloomed in my chest, until I turned and looked back up the staircase, only to find myself exactly at the vestibule level where I'd started. No subterranean depths, just the ordinary ground floor. I spent the remainder of that shift in the office, door locked, convincing myself I'd experienced some sort of spatial disorientation due to the building's unusual acoustics and my own exhaustion. When morning came, I said nothing to the arriving workers. What could I say? That the stairs were playing tricks, that the building was somehow spatially wrong. They'd think I was drinking on the job. Tuesday night, I avoided the main staircase entirely, using the utility stairs at the back of the building for my rounds. But at midnight, another anomaly demanded my attention. The ornate gas lamps that lined the vestibule, long since converted to electric but maintaining their vintage appearance, began to flicker despite being powered off. Inside their glass globes, non-existent flames wavered and danced, casting weak pools of amber light that shouldn't be possible. I checked the breaker panels, finding all switches for the vestibule fixtures in the off position. When I returned, the phantom illumination continued, each lamp pulsing gently, as if breathing. I approached one hesitantly, feeling a chill, as my hand detected no heat through the glass. The light inside moved like flame, but generated no warmth. I unscrewed one globe with trembling fingers, expecting the light to dissipate, but it remained, now floating freely, without its container. An impossible fire burning in open air. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The noise echoed through the building's hollow spaces, returning distorted, as though filtered through water. That's when I first heard the humming. It wasn't mechanical, not the building's ancient boiler, or the temporary generators outside. This was melodic, almost vocal, a tuneless drone that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I followed it instinctively, my flashlight beam cutting through dust-filled air as the humming led me toward the auditorium, the one place I'd been unconsciously avoiding. The massive double doors were unlocked, though I was certain I'd secured them earlier. They swung open at my touch with well-oiled silence, revealing the cavernous space beyond. My light seemed swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only small patches of the drop cloth-covered seats and the proscenium arch, looming above the stage. The humming grew more distinct here, vibrating in my chest cavity like bass notes from powerful speakers. I asked if anyone was there, my voice thin and uncertain. The humming paused briefly before resuming at a slightly higher pitch. My skin prickled with gooseflesh as I advanced down the center aisle, dust motes swimming in my flashlight beam. The stage stood 8 feet above floor level, its curtains removed for cleaning, leaving a gaping black void. As I approached, I noticed something odd about the stage floor. It seemed to undulate subtly, wooden planks rising and falling in gentle waves. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were deceiving me. When I looked again, the stage was still, but the air above it shimmered like heat waves over summer asphalt. The humming localized to directly overhead, drawing my gaze upward to the domed ceiling where elaborate plasterwork depicted classical muses. In the inadequate beam of my flashlight, their faces appeared distorted, mouths stretched too wide, eyes too deep. One figure in particular, a woman with flowing hair holding what might have been a lyre, seemed to regard me directly, her head tilted at an impossible angle. My rational mind supplied explanations. Stress, sleep deprivation, perhaps mold spores affecting my cognitive function. I backed away, promising myself I'd request a transfer to day shift, citing health concerns if necessary. As I retreated to the doors, the humming followed, maintaining a consistent distance behind me. Something brushed against my neck, a cobweb, I desperately told myself, not phantom fingers. The next night, I came prepared with a digital recorder, a carbon monoxide detector, and a stubborn determination to document whatever was happening. The project manager had denied my request for reassignment with a condescending reminder that night watchmen were difficult to find at the salary they offered. He suggested I bring a radio for company if the silence was getting to me. I began my shift with a systematic inspection, recording baseline readings throughout the building. The carbon monoxide levels were normal. I took photographs of the staircase. From various angles, careful documentation for what I was increasingly certain was an anomaly beyond my understanding. At 11:30 p.m., I set the recorder on the bottom step of the main staircase and began climbing. The resistance began immediately, stronger than before. I pushed against it, leaning forward like walking into strong wind. My breathing became labored. Despite the minimal physical exertion, halfway up, I froze as a reflection caught my eye in the decorative mirror on the landing. My ascending figure appeared to be moving downward, my steps reversed like badly edited film. I forced myself to continue, sweat soaking my shirt despite the building's perpetual chill. At the top, I retrieved my recorder and rewound it. The playback contained my footsteps and labored breathing, but beneath them ran another sound, a faint scratching, like phonograph needles on empty vinyl, punctuated by what could have been words in a language too fragmentary to identify. I descended with my eyes closed, counting steps. There should have been exactly 22 treads between the mezzanine and ground floor. I counted 37 before my foot met level ground. When I opened my eyes, I was indeed at the vestibule, the spatial distortion resolving itself once again into mundane reality. My legs trembled with the adrenaline aftermath. The gas lamps were lit again with their heatless, impossible flames. I approached one and spoke directly to it, asking what was happening, feeling only partially ridiculous. The flame elongated toward me, like a curious finger, before resuming its natural shape. I laughed nervously, the sound echoing back at me, with a quality that wasn't quite right, as though someone else had laughed simultaneously, their timing milliseconds off from mine. I retreated to the office, but found no sanctuary there. The room had changed subtly, the desk 2 inches further from the wall than I remembered, the chair at a different angle than I'd left it. My coffee thermos was open, though I was certain I'd closed it. Small discrepancies that together formed a picture of wrongness. The humming began again, now accompanied by a soft tapping from inside the walls. Not the random settling of an old building, but rhythmic, intentional. I pressed my ear against the floral patterned wallpaper and heard what sounded like fingernails moving behind the plaster. When I pulled away, the wallpaper retained a slight indentation where nothing had visibly pressed against it. I considered leaving, simply walking out and never returning, abandoning both job and final paycheck. But a strange compulsion kept me there, a need to understand what was happening. The project manager had mentioned the theater's storied past when hiring. Me boasting about famous performances and illustrious careers launched on its stage. He hadn't mentioned tragedies or accidents, though surely a building this old had witnessed its share of misfortunes. I wondered what history lay buried beneath the renovations. What memories remained impressed upon the physical space like grooves on a record. At 3 a.m., I forced myself to return to the auditorium, drawn by the intensifying hum that had become almost musical. The doors swung open before I touched them, revealing the space transformed. Though no actual lights were on, the room glowed, with diffuse illumination that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The drop cloths had been removed from the seats, or appeared to have been, revealing faded red velvet. The stage was no longer empty but set with the suggestion of scenery, translucent flats depicting a grand salon, furnishings like mirages that sharpened and faded as I stared. I felt eyes upon me, hundreds of them, though the seats remained empty. The pressure of observation prickled across my skin as I moved down the aisle. The humming organized itself into a distant melody played on strings and woodwinds, an orchestra heard through thick walls. As I approached the stage, I noticed the pit area before it was no longer covered but open, a dark, rectangular void. From its depths rose the music, along with the subtle scent of grease paint and perfume. Logic told me to back away, but curiosity propelled me forward, until I stood at the edge, peering down into blackness that seemed deeper than the actual dimensions allowed. The music crescendoed, and with it came a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grab a seat back to remain upright. The pit appeared to expand below me, its darkness spreading outward like spilled ink. Within its depths, shadows moved with purpose. Not random patterns, but deliberate choreography, figures performing for an audience I couldn't see. The seat beneath my steadying hand warmed suddenly, as though recently vacated. I yanked my fingers away, heart pounding, as I backed toward the exit. The music followed, changing quality to something discordant and urgent. The doors, which had opened so readily before, now remained stubbornly closed, despite my frantic pushing. Trapped, I turned to face the theater again, my flashlight beam cutting ineffectually through the strange ambient glow. On the stage, a figure stood where none had been before, indistinct, more suggestion than substance. A human shape composed of shadow and refracted light. It made no move toward me but simply watched, its attention and almost physical pressure. The humming localized to this figure, emanating from where a mouth would be. I called out, demanding to know who was there, my voice cracking with strain. The figure raised an arm, pointing not at me, but toward the wall to my right. There, previously hidden by shadows, a small door stood ajar, one I'd never noticed during my rounds, maintenance access, perhaps, or storage. With the main doors still sealed, it offered the only exit. I approached cautiously, torn between fear of the beckoning passage and the watchful presence on stage. The door opened onto a narrow corridor lined with peeling show posters from decades past. A draft pulled from behind me, drawing me forward. The passageway should have led to the theater's exterior, based on my mental map of the building. But after several turns, I found myself descending a staircase that spiraled gently downward. Nothing like the utilitarian service stairs I'd used before. These steps were narrow, the ceiling low enough to require me to stoop, the walls pressing in on both sides. Unlike the main staircase, these steps didn't fight my descent, but rather hastened it, each tread tilting subtly forward to propel me downward. I ran my hand along the wall for balance and felt not plaster but something organic, warm and slightly yielding beneath my fingers. I yanked my hand away, using my flashlight to examine the surface. The wallpaper patterns seemed to shift as I watched, floral designs elongating and contracting, like slow-motion film of blooming flowers. The stairwell ended abruptly at a door identical to the one I'd entered. Fearing I'd walked in a circle, I hesitated before turning the tarnished brass knob. It opened onto the vestibule where my night's journey had begun, but subtly altered, as though I were seeing it through warped glass. The dimensions seemed wrong, the ceiling too high, the walls curved where they should be straight. The gas lamps burned brighter now, their impossible flames casting long shadows that moved independently of their sources. The main staircase dominated the space, as always, but now appeared to be constructed of something other than wood. Something reflective and mutable that caught the lamplight and swirled with colors beneath its surface. As I watched, the steps rippled like disturbed water, then settled again into solid form. I understood then what was happening, or thought I did. The Bellamy wasn't just a building, it was a threshold. The renovations had disturbed something, awakened something, or perhaps merely thinned the barrier between what was and what might be. The theater existed in multiple states simultaneously, past and present overlaid, potential futures bleeding through worn spots in reality. The humming returned, now resolving into words, just below the threshold of comprehension. Almost English, but vowels wrong. Consonants stretched. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement on the stairs, the suggestion of figures ascending and descending simultaneously. Temporal echoes of everyone who had ever walked those steps, among them, almost transparent, but growing more solid. As I focused, was a figure I recognized with sickening clarity, myself, moving both up and down the staircase in endless repetition. My doppelganger turned to face me, its expression a mirror of my own horror. Our eyes locked across impossible distance, and in that moment, the theater seemed to hold its breath. The humming ceased. The phantom flames froze, time suspended between 1 second and the next. Then, reality convulsed. Architectural space folding in on itself, like origami. Angles that should never connect, suddenly adjacent. I found myself on the stairs, not standing but sprawled as though I'd fallen, though I had no memory of mounting the steps. Above me, my double looked down with an expression not of fear but pity, before dissolving into the shadows. The staircase shuddered beneath me, steps flattening and reforming, the handrail flowing like liquid before re-solidifying. I scrambled to my feet and descended in a controlled fall, no longer caring about impossible physics or spatial distortions, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. I hit the vestibule floor running and didn't stop until I burst through the front doors into the blessed normality of the street. Dawn was breaking, painting the city in comforting grays and blues. I gulped cold air, hands on knees, as a passing jogger gave me a curious glance. Behind me, the Bellamy's facade stood silent and ordinary, early sunlight gleaming on its stained glass accents. I'd never returned for my final paycheck, or the paperback I'd left in the office, when the theater reopened 6 months later after successful renovations. I avoided the gala celebration despite its coverage in local media. The project manager left 2 voicemails asking about my abrupt departure, then nothing. Life moved on. I found factory work 2 towns over, but sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear that humming, distant but distinct, and in my bathroom mirror, if I glance too quickly, I occasionally catch my reflection moving a half second after I've stopped. In those moments, I understand that I didn't truly escape. I merely extended the threshold. The Bellamy released me, but it kept something in exchange, some fragment of myself still ascending and descending those impossible stairs, trapped in the overlap between what is and what cannot be. And sometimes, I feel it calling that missing piece home. Story 6. The first time I saw them, I convinced myself it was just fatigue. The mind's way of filling empty spaces with familiar shapes. But empty spaces aren't supposed to move. Empty spaces don't track your movements, and they certainly don't. Breathe. My name is Daniel Mercer, curator of contemporary photography at the Wexler Museum of Visual Arts. When the board approved my proposal for Reflections, Photography in the Digital Age, I was ecstatic. 3 months of work, culminating in what would be the most innovative exhibition of my career. The museum's newly renovated West Wing featured a remarkable chamber. Walls lined with polished metal panels that the architect had described as living mirrors. The space was meant to create an infinite reflection of the artwork, allowing viewers to experience photography from countless perspectives simultaneously. That was the theory, anyway. I arrived early that Monday, 2 weeks before opening night. The installation team had finished mounting the panel system over the weekend, and I was eager to begin arranging the collection. The morning light streamed through the skylight, dancing across the metallic surfaces. Except the surfaces weren't reflecting anything. Instead of the expected mirror finish, the walls had taken on a flat, matte gray appearance. I approached one panel, running my fingers across its surface. Cold, perfectly smooth, but absorbing all light like some impossible material. I called maintenance immediately. The head technician arrived within minutes, his face contorting in confusion as he examined the panels. He insisted they had been reflective during installation, brilliantly mirrored surfaces that had required careful handling to avoid fingerprints. We checked the manufacturer's specifications, confirming the panels were aircraft-grade aluminum with a mirror finish. The technician mentioned something about molecular structure changes being impossible without extreme heat, all while avoiding eye contact, clearly unsettled by what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing after he left. Promising to consult with the manufacturer, I remained in the gallery, attempting to work around this unexpected development. Perhaps the matte finish could serve the exhibition concept in a different way. I began testing various lighting configurations, plotting where each piece would be displayed. As afternoon faded to evening, I found myself alone in the museum, most staff having departed hours earlier. The security guard had made his rounds, nodding respectfully before informing me he'd be stationed at the front desk if needed. I preferred working in solitude, especially when planning exhibition layouts. Testing the dramatic effect of different lighting on the photographs required complete darkness between adjustments. I switched off the overhead lights, plunging the gallery into blackness so complete I couldn't see my hand before my face. I waited for my eyes to adjust before activating the first spotlight. That's when I saw it, a brief flicker in my peripheral vision, like a camera flash. I turned but encountered only darkness. I attributed it to retinal aftermages and continued working. Then it happened again, a silent burst of light that left no illumination, yet somehow registered in my vision. I stood motionless, waiting. A third flash, but this time I could make out a shape within it, a negative image like an old photographic plate, showing what appeared to be a human silhouette. It lasted only a fraction of a second before dissolving into the darkness. My heart rate accelerated, a cold sweat forming at my temples. I tried convincing myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of sensory deprivation. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual. Breathing deeply to calm my racing pulse, I continued working, refusing to acknowledge what I'd seen. Over the next hour, the phenomena intensified. Flashes appeared with increasing frequency, each revealing more detailed negative images. People walking slowly through the darkness, their forms rendered in stark white against black, like photographic negatives frozen in air. They moved in paths that always seemed to circle around my position, never approaching directly but never moving away either. My hands trembled as I activated the main lighting system. The gallery flooded with light, and the images vanished instantly. I stood there, heart hammering against my ribcage, mouth dry, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Sleep deprivation, stress, overwork. Any explanation seemed preferable to what my senses had registered. I recalled the thermal imaging camera in my office, part of a planned display on infrared photography. Perhaps it could detect abnormalities in the room. I retrieved it, hands still shaking slightly, and began scanning the gallery. The display showed normal temperature readings until I pointed it at the area where I'd seen the flashes. There, unmistakably, were heat signatures, human-shaped thermal imprints, moving in circular patterns despite the room being empty. My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. I tracked these heat signatures as they wove around the room, always maintaining distance but clearly aware of my presence. They adjusted their paths whenever I moved, keeping the same relative distance. I needed documentation, evidence that I wasn't hallucinating. I set up a tripod and mounted both the standard digital camera and the thermal imager, programming them to take simultaneous exposures at 10-second intervals. After positioning them to capture most of the gallery, I shut off the lights. The flashes returned immediately. With each burst, I caught glimpses of more figures, their features becoming increasingly defined. Not just silhouettes now, but faces. Expressionless, eyes wide and hollow, mouths slightly open as if frozen mid-breath. They moved with deliberate slowness, their paths more complex than I'd initially perceived, forming patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. My skin prickled with gooseflesh, each hair standing on end. A pervasive cold had settled in the room, my breath now visible in faint clouds. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in minutes, defying the building's climate control system. After 30 minutes that felt like hours, I reactivated the lights and examined the cameras. The digital camera had captured nothing unusual, just empty gallery spaces, but the thermal imager told a different story. Each frame showed heat signatures moving in precise patterns, creating a complex choreography around where I had stood. Most disturbing were the moments when several forms converged, their thermal signatures intensifying as if communicating or transferring energy. I downloaded the images to my laptop, hands trembling so violently I mistyped my password twice. The security guard checked on me, noticing my distress. I fabricated an excuse about deadline pressure. Something prevented me from sharing what I'd witnessed. A primal instinct warning that speaking the phenomenon aloud would somehow strengthen it. After he left, I examined the thermal images more carefully. The patterns weren't random. The figures appeared to be tracing shapes on the floor, shapes that corresponded exactly with the layout I'd been planning for the exhibition. Somehow, they knew precisely where each photograph would be placed, weeks before installation. This realization sent a shock of ice through my veins. Whatever these entities were, they anticipated my intentions, perhaps even influenced them. Had I been unknowingly arranging the exhibition according to their design? The thought made me nauseous, acid burning the back of my throat. I gathered my equipment hastily, unable to remain in that space any longer. As I reached the doorway, the lights flickered momentarily. In that microsecond of darkness, I felt something brush past me, cold, insubstantial, yet undeniably present. My heart nearly seized, muscles locking in primal terror. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I pored over historical documents related to the museum, searching for any mention of unusual occurrences. Nothing significant emerged until I discovered architectural notes from the original construction in 1892. The West Wing had been built over the site of a photography studio that had burned down in 1888, killing. No, I corrected myself, remembering newspaper accounts stated everyone had escaped the fire. However, the studio had specialized in post-mortem photography, that Victorian practice of photographing the recently deceased as mementos for grieving families. I returned the next morning, equipped with more sophisticated recording equipment. The sensation of being watched intensified the moment I entered the gallery. The metal panels seemed darker somehow, their matte surface appearing to pulse subtly, like something breathing. I set up multiple cameras, standard thermal and one modified to capture ultraviolet light. Hours passed as I worked, documenting the phenomena under controlled conditions. With each cycle of darkness, the negative images grew more distinct, more numerous. They no longer merely circled, but approached, their movements becoming more deliberate, more aware. In thermal imaging, their heat signatures intensified, creating patterns that resembled written language when viewed in sequence. By late afternoon, my scientific detachment had eroded completely. My shirt clung to my sweat-soaked back, hands trembling uncontrollably. Something fundamental had changed. The entities now remained partially visible even when the lights were on, appearing as subtle distortions in the air, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. I attempted communication, first through written questions held up to the cameras, then verbally. No direct response came, but the patterns changed, becoming more concentrated around me. The temperature fluctuations intensified, freezing cold alternating with pockets of stifling heat. My ears registered subtle variations in atmospheric pressure, creating the sensation of whispers just below the threshold of hearing. As sunset approached, casting long shadows through the skylight, I made a critical discovery. While reviewing the ultraviolet footage, the UV camera had captured what the others missed. Residual trails left by the entities, glowing faintly like photographic emulsion exposed to light. These trails matched exactly the placement of photographs in exhibitions from the past century, exhibitions long dismantled and archived. The implications struck me with physical force. These weren't random manifestations, but impressions left by past observers, somehow captured and preserved by the unique properties of this space. The metal panels weren't reflecting light, but absorbing and storing visual information. Like some impossible photographic plate, recording not just images, but the very presence of those who had stood before them. This theory was confirmed when I discovered my own negative image among them, a perfect rendering of myself from the previous day, repeating my exact movements. The room was capturing us all, creating permanent records of transient moments. I considered abandoning the exhibition entirely, but realized that wasn't an option. Whatever forces operated here had been accumulating for decades, perhaps centuries. My presence had merely activated what was already there, like developer solution revealing a latent image. I made a decision then, one that professional colleagues might consider career suicide, but felt instinctively correct. I would proceed with the exhibition, but with the crucial modification. Instead of displaying contemporary photography, I would leave the walls bare, installing only carefully positioned lighting that would activate at programmed intervals, plunging sections of the gallery into calculated darkness. The exhibition would reveal itself, the accumulated visual history of the space, manifesting as these photographic negatives in air. Visitors would become both observers and subjects simultaneously, viewing and being recorded by whatever impossible process operated within those metal panels. I've spent the past week preparing appropriate context materials, explaining the phenomenon in terms of experimental photography and interactive art rather than anything supernatural. The board members were skeptical until I demonstrated a controlled manifestation. Their expressions transformed from doubt to awe as they witnessed negative images form in darkness, their own thermal signatures joining the complex choreography captured by my instruments. Tomorrow, we open to the public. I've named the exhibition Negative Space, Photography Without Cameras. Advanced ticket sales have broken museum records. Critics have been sworn to secrecy after preview viewings left them visibly shaken, but enthusiastically supportive. As for me, I've made peace with what happens in the darkness of that gallery. I've accepted that when I walk through the exhibition tomorrow, my negative image from today will be there, watching me, watching it, in an infinite regression of observer and observed. Sometimes, at night, alone in my apartment, I feel the familiar sensation of silent flashes in my peripheral vision, glimpsing negative images of figures moving just beyond focus. I've begun to understand that once recorded by that impossible process, one never truly leaves the frame. The boundaries between subject and medium have dissolved. The exhibition will be my masterpiece, though I'll share credit with I can never name. After all, art has always been about capturing moments in time, preserving what would otherwise be lost. I just never expected those moments to be looking back